All right, welcome to our Bible study this evening. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20. So if you'd like to turn there, we'll get started, and let's go ahead and read that passage.
Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until it is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of God. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.
All right, so Jesus here is addressing a problem that comes up, and it's really interesting that when people talk about who Jesus is, it really varies widely depending on who you're asking. You know, if you ask somebody who's kind of a liberal humanist, Jesus might be a great teacher. If you talk to a Marxist, Jesus might be a revolutionary. If you talk to, just almost everybody you talk to, they see Jesus in a different light. And I think what Jesus is anticipating here is that response that he gets, that Jesus is somehow, people seem to try to plug him into the mold that they already have created about what they want him to be, and that's what people tend to think that he is. And, I remember going, in college, depending on which professor that you have, you kind of got a little different slant on exactly who Jesus is. And the ones that were more kind of social justice oriented, well, Jesus was here to remake society, and he was here to reform all that stuff. And somebody else who was more theologically driven, that's not what Jesus was here. It was theologically oriented. And the problem is that Jesus, even in his day, had that issue come up because the religious leaders didn't know what to do with him. The disciples, they follow Jesus around and they don't know exactly what to make of him, but they're interested enough that they keep going. But think about how many times that there's this interaction between Jesus and his disciples where they just don't get it. I mean, it happens so often that, Peter is usually at the, heart of that. It's not always him, but it seems like it is a lot. And they just don't know what to do with him. And the religious leaders certainly don't know what to do with him, and the people, nobody knows what to make of Jesus. And so here he comes out and he says, "Look, I'm not here to abolish the law and the prophets. I've come here not to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Now, why might Jesus be addressing that idea here in this moment where we have the Sermon on the Mount? Why might Jesus be saying right at this moment, "Hey, don't get the wrong idea"? What is it about the Sermon on the Mount that might give people the wrong idea?
Whether he might be trying to organize some kind of...
He could be.
I had laughed to myself.
Yeah.
I can't picture Jesus saying one iota.
Yeah.
That word that you read,
Yeah.
it just doesn't seem like it would come out of Jesus.
Yes, it doesn't really fit too well, does it?
An iota.
An iota.
Because the Pharisees were only teaching the law.
Okay, because the Pharisees are only teaching the law. That could be an issue that's cropping up.
Well, how could you not have a question on who it was? I mean, really, would anybody know?
Yeah, that's the thing that's interesting, is that he's kind of an enigma, and there isn't one person that really gets it right. So Dan, what do you think?
Well, in the Sermon on the Mount, it's a lot of talk about how the least shall be praised.
Okay.
And in society, the least are not often considered the most righteous.
Okay. So there's a moral aspect to this in the cultural view of the day, that he seems to be saying something incredibly scandalous, I guess we could say, right? That there's an element of scandal to what Jesus is saying, because he's almost talking about upending all of the social structures and even maybe the moral and religious structures. And that's a very difficult thing for people to grasp and deal with. And then on top of all that, what you have is Jesus saying, well, you've heard it said, and then he says, but I say to you. You know, he does it. How many times does he do that in the Sermon on the Mount? Over and over again, right? You've heard it said this, but I say to you. Over and over and over again, he seems to be contradicting what's happening. And so I would imagine that people, you know, we have a tendency to read the Sermon on the Mount and go, okay, well, Jesus is teaching. And we don't understand the kind of the head scratching that would have been going on. And there probably would have been some people getting irate. You know, if you preach a sermon and people want to kill you, and that happens to Jesus, you know, you're certainly getting a reaction out of people, but maybe not the one you were hoping for. But over and over again, what happens here is that people don't know what to do with this, and people are intrigued by it, but it's incredibly confusing to them, and they don't really know what he's going on about. And then the same thing will happen to some of the Christians later on. You know, Paul goes to the Areopagus, and they don't really know what he's talking about. This is a big problem. So what is exactly Jesus saying? He's saying, I haven't come to abolish the law. Look, there's he's saying a lot of things that are about upending. And then he says, but I'm not here to abolish the law. So in order to kind of grasp what's going on here, it's probably good for us to think about some analogies. And there's a TV show called, what is the name of the TV show with the upside down? You guys remember? Stranger Things, yes. Stranger Things, and I don't know if you guys, have you seen it? No? You've heard of it. And you guys haven't seen it?
Just when I went to work every day.
Okay. Yes, I can see that. Okay, so, and I know you guys know, you've seen it, right? Yes, okay. So there's this TV show called Stranger Things. And in this TV show, there is a girl that has psychic powers, and the government uses her to open up a rift in kind of time and space. And she opens up kind of a door to another dimension. And when you go through the door, it's called the upside down because it's still the same place, but it's not the same place. Everything is wrong. Everything, you know, there's maybe a gas station in the regular world, but when you go across the door, there's the gas station, and it's all overgrown, and it's still the same gas station, but yet somehow it's all been overgrown and fallen apart, and there's terrible creatures on the other side of this. They're like combinations of things that you might see in our world. It's a scary, terrible place. And the problem is that once this door is open, then stuff from the upside down starts to come through into the regular world, and it creates this huge problem. And these young kids, junior high age kids, are wrapped up in the middle of this. So, you know, and it's a fun kind of idea for a show, and it takes place in the 80s. So if you're my age, the nostalgia is great because I was that age during that time and all that. But the thing is that the idea is that when you go through this world, if everything is upside down, then what seems normal to the people on the other side is not going to be normal at all. But how would they know, right? So imagine going to a world, having a dimension open where everything's like a Dr. Seuss book, or everything's like, you know, like some kind of strange fantasy land. Those people would see that as completely normal. There's a sense in which what Jesus is doing is he's entering the upside down world. We live in the upside down world. We live where everything is wrong. Everything is bizarre. And he's the normal person. He's the only normal person. And he comes and we find his behavior completely baffling. And we don't know what to make of it. And as soon as we try to label it or get an idea of what he's doing, we find that we're completely wrong at every turn. In reality, what Jesus is doing is he's not doing what we tend to think of. He's not inverting the hierarchy. So we've talked about this idea that every religion creates a hierarchy, and we talked about it like a pyramid. And the idea is that it creates a value system where you can say some things have more value than other things, and And for instance, money. Where does money fall in the value system? Well, should it be at the top? Well, no, it shouldn't be at the top. It creates this hierarchy. And then societies build themselves off of this value system. And that's why if you go to a medieval town in the middle of Europe, you go to a medieval city there's always going to be a town square. What's going to be in the center of the town square? Well, the church is, right? Because that's the ancient model of a city. And it lasted all the way up through the Middle Ages. In fact, from the time of way before Jesus, from the time of Job, when cities were relatively young in their history, from that time until the Middle Ages, cities always were built around a temple, because the temple is the foundation for everything in the culture and everything in the society. Everything's built on this idea of what has value. And the problem is that Jesus is not coming here to turn that over, which is what we suspect. When Jesus starts saying some things, like you pointed out, Dan, how the last will be first, or the first will be last, or the least of these, or all the things that Jesus says, it sounds like what Jesus is saying is, well, we're going to take everything that's on the bottom of the hierarchy, and we're going to turn it over, and so now that's at the top. And that becomes something that modern revolutionaries try to do all the time, right? So if you think about Stalin, if you think about the Russians, right? So we're going to take the bottom class people. In fact, the whole communist system is about this idea of inverting the hierarchy. So what do you have when you have, in the communist system, there's two classes of people, generally. What are they? What are the two classes? The two strata of people? The proletariat, right?
But there's always
And
somebody up top.
Right. In the so there's the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So it's the people who are rich and powerful against all the normal people. And what communism was about, it was about a revolution that the proletariat would take over, and they're going to run things, right? And so what happened is they take the kulaks, who are in the middle of the Ukraine and in all different places in Russia. The kulaks were these farmers who were peasants, but they were successful and they started having money. And what they did was they took away everything from them. In fact, a lot of times what they'd do is they'd go into a town, and anybody with a 2-story house was a bad guy because they had a 2-story house. And a lot of times what they would do is they would just drive them out of town. And these guys would go into the wilderness, they'd go into the marshes and try to live there until they starved to death or froze to death. Right? Because what we're doing is turning it over.
Today,
Yeah.
The socialist movement wants to make everybody equal.
Right.
But it's never that way.
No.
There's always somebody, even if you're in some kind of horrible motorcycle gang, where everybody's on their own,
Right.
there's going to be some guy that runs the thing.
Oh, yeah.
There's always going to be an authority.
And that's the funny thing is,
You can't exist without an authority. And so even though they turn it upside down, there's still somebody on.
Right.
There's still somebody on top.
Yeah, exactly.
What you said earlier about you could do this for an English composition, walking through things. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you go through the wardrobe. Alice in Wonderland, she goes through the looking glass.
Yeah,
In Star Trek, you go
through hyperspace. Yeah.
Whatever that is.
Yeah.
Whenever people writers want you to go someplace different, they have to go through something.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
something- I never noticed that before.
Yeah, that's totally true. And so that's the idea here. So the question is Jesus just trying to take our hierarchy and flip it over? And what Jesus is saying here is no. The hierarchy is built off of the law, and Jesus is not trying to upend that. He's not trying to destroy that. He's not trying to just turn that over, which is what we do. You see, the problem is that we live in the upside down, and we think, well, all you have to do to make this right is to just turn it over. But the reality is that our thinking is upside down. So that's not actually what you have to do at all, right? You get so many upside downs, you don't know which way's up. But the idea here is that
In the old Batman comics, did you ever read that? What was the world that
Oh, Bizarro.
Bizarro world.
Yeah, yeah.
Everything is backwards.
Yeah, and there's Bizarro Superman, and there's all the DC Comics guys. Yeah, yeah, it's the same. It's the same sort of idea. It's the same idea. So what happens here is that Jesus then, what is he actually proposing then? He's not proposing just turning this upside down, and not at all. What he's actually proposing is not turning the hierarchy upside down, but turning us upside down.
I would say he wants to turn us right side up.
Right. Yes. To
I
us,
would say.
it's upside down. To him, it's right side up. So he's not talking about turning the structure. He's talking about turning us, and that's the problem that we have with them. And so this idea, what's really interesting is this idea, this word that he uses here when he says that he's here to fulfill the law. That's actually not. It's a more comprehensive word than what we think it is. It means much more than just oh well, it's like checking off the box, right? That's not what it means. It doesn't mean, like, you guys probably worked at places before where at the end of the day, before you could go home, you had a checklist you had to fulfill before you went home. That's not what this is talking about. In fact, Jesus has used this word in a few times already, so let's look at those. Matthew chapter 2, verse 15. Let's read that one.
And remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son."
Right. So the idea here is fulfilling this passage from Hosea chapter 11:1, and it's not just like this is a check mark that has to be checked. It's that the idea is that Jesus is actually what this was written about. All right, let's look at verses 17 and 18 of chapter 2.
Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more.
Okay, so once again, a fulfillment here. And again, what this means is not that Jesus is checking a box. It means that this passage was actually written about Jesus.
Well, I have a note that I have no idea when I wrote it, but it says if the fulfill comes from a Jewish word meaning to give it full meaning. And is that the same word that's used in the...
Well, so what happens is that you have two things. You have, if it's a Hebrew word that you're talking about, then that would be the Old Testament word. This will be written in Greek.
Well, right, written in Greek, but his original word would have been...
Right. But the concept here in Greek is that you are showing the full, kind of like what you're saying, you're showing the full extent, or what would be a good example of how we would do this? It's kind of like the difference between you go to the doctor's office and you have those, you go to if I would go to the ear, nose, and throat guy again, and he would have that little model head, that you see in there. Sometimes it's like a cutaway and it has all the little things. So that's full. I would be the fulfillment of that. You know what I'm saying? So this is something that is only partially there. It's not really full. It's not really complete. It's not really the true manifestation.
Well, if you use that concept, and I'm sorry to do so much talking.
No, that's
use
okay.
that concept of the shadow that
Right.
we talked about. These were shadow things to come.
Right.
All the things in the Old Testament led up to Jesus.
Yeah.
So therefore, when Jesus came, he was for the fulfillment,
Right.
the ultimate meaning of what the Passover lamb was,
Yeah.
or what the,
Yeah.
So
Yeah, you could think of it. You could think of
that's
it.
why these guys are having such a hard time. I mean, Moses gave them the law 1,400 years before this, and all of a sudden this guy comes along and says, "Nah." That's
Yeah.
not it.
Yeah, and you could think of it maybe this way: is you have the word cat, and then you have an actual cat, and you say, well, which one is cat? Well, they both are. One is the near thing, one is the far thing, but the far thing is really the cat, right? or your name. You see your name written down, and somebody goes, well, where are you? And they point to a list of names. Where are you? And you say, I'm here. No, where are you? Right? It's that concept of your name is you, but it's not fully you. So the idea is that all these everything in the Old Testament is like the name written down. It's the near thing, but it's a shadow. It's only partially there. And Jesus, when he fulfills the law, he's the actual thing. So it's not like we have this idea that Jesus goes around going, okay, well, I have to not lie. That's not what Jesus had to do. Jesus just was himself, because the law was a description of him. He's not acting out the law. The law is the description of him.
Who's that real famous Greek philosopher? I can't think of his name.
Well, there's
He's
several
the
of them.
one- His teaching was that there is an original of everything.
Yeah, so the idea of
Up in the
forms.
sky, there's an original desk,
Right.
there's an original this, and everything on earth is just a copy of it.
Yeah,
That was his philosophy.
yeah, like a
And
form.
that's basically what you're saying.
It's kind of like that. It's kind of like that. So that's the idea is that Jesus is that. But it's not just with the law. It's not just with the law, though. It's with everything that's written in the Old Testament. That all these things, that all these prophecies, all these stories, these are really just actions. It's the life of Jesus being foreshadowed. Does that make sense? So when we look at this, what we want to understand is that if this is all about Jesus, if the Old Testament is all about Jesus, then it's not just about Jesus walking around or Jesus doing miracles or Jesus teaching. It's also about Jesus and the cross. Right? So think about what Jesus really fulfills, or what Jesus is most known for. What is his most important thing about him, the most important thing that he does on this earth? It's the cross. And so if you think about it from that standpoint, everything in the Old Testament, everything that's going on in there is really about Jesus, and it's about the cross. Right? So think about all the times with Israel, all the times that they sin, all the times that there's God's judgment, all the times that all of those things are going on through the Old Testament, the law, the sacrifices, all that stuff. It's all about Jesus, but it's all about the cross. And so the point here is that we have this tendency to look at, or the world at least has a tendency to look at God and look at the Old Testament and say, well, how could he be so cruel, or how could he be so harsh, or how could he be so judgmental, or whatever it is that they like to accuse God of. But yet all of that is really a picture of Jesus and a picture of the cross of Christ. Like all that judgment that you see there, that's all a picture of what Jesus is taking. It's all a picture of what Jesus is doing. He's the fulfillment of all those things in the law. Right? So we want to talk about sacrifice here, because when we start thinking about that, then the Old Testament sacrifices become important. And this is a picture, I don't know if you guys ever saw the True Grit, the more recent remake of the True Grit movie that the Coen brothers did. There's the old John Wayne one that's been around forever. And then in 2005, 8, somewhere, I don't know, somewhere around there, there was a remake done, and they come across this character who's riding his horse, and it just looks like there's a bear riding a horse, because he's got his head down, and then he puts his head up, and you see it's this old trapper guy, and he's wearing this great bear skin, and he's a very odd character in the show. Anybody here familiar with that? None? Yeah. Okay. So what would you say about his character? How would you describe him? Oh, you don't? You don't? There's a dead body, and he wants to see if he can buy the dead body, and then he tries to sell it to somebody else or something. So it's an odd thing, but it fits along with his character, because what does it mean to wear a dead animal? We talked about how in the story of the fall with Adam and Eve, that they make clothes out of plants, but God says no, that's not good enough, and He makes clothes out of animal skins, and that's a weird thing. It's a weird thing because you don't think about God going, hey, let me kill this animal over here because you're.
I thought they did that after they fell.
Well, they made the clothing out of leaves, but then God came and provided them clothes of animal skins. So it's a little weird thing, and there's so much in these stories that we're the upside down people. We don't know what's going on, so we shake our heads. But the question is, why are animal skin clothes the thing to do? Why is that what you should do? Why should you wear animal skin clothes? It's really why should we all go down to Wilson's Leather and buy a leather jacket tonight when we get done? Bonnie, are you going to get one? No. So the idea here is that they experienced death, right? When Adam and Eve sinned, they experienced death. And God says, well, these plant clothes aren't good enough for you. You have to be clothed with dead animals. You have to be clothed with death. And there's a whole bunch of, talking about stories and how writers will write those things. There's a whole bunch of stories about being able to hide from death. And Harry Potter's one of them. We talked about this, the idea that Harry Potter has this invisibility cloak. And the reason it was made to hide the wearer from death. And it's one of the Deathly Hallows, and I think it was made by death. And it will hide you from death. And the idea is that death hides you from death. Well, how is that true? Well, it's the same thing. It's the same idea as the sacrificial system. When you go and you make a sacrifice, you're hiding from your sins, and you're being covered by death. Right? So if you're, let's say, Larry, you're going to go and you're going to make a sacrifice because you were mean to Bonnie, probably.
So I'm going to quit eating chocolate chip cookies for a month.
That's it. You're gonna have to. You've been eating too many. You've been. I love chocolate chip cookies. So you've been eating too many chocolate chip cookies, and so you're going to go down and you're going to make a sacrifice, and you put your hand on the animal, and then you actually kill the animal, and then the animal's blood is displayed, and then that gets put on after it's cut up and things. It gets put on the altar, and it gets burned on the altar. Well, by you putting your hand on the animal and killing it, it's representing your death. You're hiding from death with death, right? Well, all of that points to Jesus. All of that points to being covered with the blood of Christ. It's the same thing as when the Exodus happens. The angel of death flies over, and he's killing people in these houses. But which houses does he pass over? The ones that have blood on the doorpost. Why? Because they're hiding from death with death.
It made me think of in Galatians, and now I think maybe I shouldn't make that connection.
No, go ahead.
It says that you are all the sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For all of you who are baptized in Christ have clothed yourself with Christ.
Right. And you clothe yourself with Christ's death, and then you get clothed with his life. But you have to clothe yourself with his death first in order to be clothed with his life. And that goes back to baptism, right? That's what you're doing in baptism, is you're being clothed with the death of Christ so you can be raised up and given new clothing.
That's why it can't come later. Baptism can't come later.
Yep.
You know,
I brought it up.
It doesn't, no, but it
Right.
would be out of place if it did.
Exactly. Yep. It's exactly right.
But the whole thing for me helps me a lot when somebody taught me once, you have to think of God as outside of time.
Mm-hmm.
Everything you're describing is because we believe in linear time.
Right.
For Jesus' participation in the sacrifice is outside of time.
Right.
There isn't, all these events that lead up to it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We can't conceive of it.
Well, and that's interesting too, because when we go through this and we see Jesus' life being a mirror of everything that happens in the Old Testament, it doesn't happen exactly like in normal time. Things are sometimes out of order, and that's not the important thing here. And again, I don't think that time is that important to God. So the idea here is that you have this idea of sacrifice. Let's look at Genesis chapter 9, 1 through 6. And we're going to see a couple things here about the idea of judgment and the idea of, because Jesus' argument is going to go from this idea of him being the fulfillment of the law. He's next going to show how that's happening in several different areas. And the first one's going to be anger. So let's look at Genesis chapter 9, verse 1 through 6.
And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image.
All right, so here's an interesting thing. So we talked about how everything in the Old Testament is about Jesus, and that means it's all focused then on the cross, right? Because that's the most important aspect of Jesus' ministry on earth. It's the most important aspect of what he does here on earth. And so everything's focused in on Jesus and focused in on the cross. Well, in Genesis chapter 9, you have the situation where all this evil stuff was going and getting really out of hand. And then Noah comes, and then there's a flood, then the earth is destroyed, and then Noah's there. And this happens, Genesis chapter 9 happens when Noah is out of the ark, and there's a new covenant made with Noah. And the idea here is that if somebody murders somebody, then his life is forfeit, okay? And what's the reasoning behind his life being forfeit if he murders somebody? Because there's the last sentence or the last couple sentences, I think it's probably the last sentence you read. Because God made man in his own image. The idea here is that in murdering somebody, you murder the image of God. And so you can't do that. It's not something that you can do. And it's so serious that you have this death penalty associated with it. All right, if we go to Exodus chapter 21, verse 12 through 17, let's read that.
Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. But if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar, that he may die. Whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. Whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death.
Okay, so now we have this expansion on this death penalty. And so the first thing that we have is that if you kill somebody, you're going to be put to death. But it says if a guy falls into your hand and you kill him, then you aren't put to death. What does that mean, to fall into your hand? Yeah, it's an accidental. Then you have to flee to a city of refuge, and there's a trial, and all that kind of stuff happens, okay? And people will decide, hey, was this actually an accident, or did you just kill him? And so why would we make the distinction between somebody killing somebody on purpose and somebody killing them accidentally? Killing them. Okay, yeah, so it comes back to the knowing and wanton destruction of the image of God. So one of them is an accidental, right? And so your goal wasn't to destroy the image of God, it's just something that happened. The other one is the idea that you wantonly, you decided you were going to do this. And so the will and what's in your heart becomes important, because you're not trying to destroy the image of God in one aspect or one situation, but you're exactly trying to do that in the other. So your heart becomes important. And that gets kind of actually extended through the rest of this passage. So I don't know if you noticed, but so if you what are the other things that get you the death penalty in this passage besides just murdering somebody? Striking your mother and father. Now, why would that be death penalties type stuff? You're overthrowing the hierarchy, right? And in doing so, if God is our Father, then there's an attack on the image of that, because what is a father but an image of God the Father, right? So there's an attack on that image, and that attack on that image of God is something that gets dealt with the death penalty. All right? And then what's the other thing that you can get killed for here? Yeah, kidnapping somebody. Because if you're kidnapping somebody, it's an assault on the image of God. How is it an assault on the image of God? You're not killing him. You're devaluing him, right? You're treating him as if he is a commodity, as if he's like an animal. You're destroying the idea of his value and his worth. And this is actually really important to understanding what Jesus is going to say here, and we're talking about how Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. And the very thing that Jesus is going to get into, we're going to read right now, is Matthew 5:21 through 26. Jesus is going to talk about anger, and if you understand these aspects of the law, you're going to understand more about why Jesus says what he does about anger.
You have heard that it was said to those of old, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment." But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother shall be liable to the council, and whoever says "you fool" will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny.
Okay, so Jesus is the fulfillment of the law, and Jesus is basically, then he's fulfilling a lot of concepts around the law when he talks about anger. He's saying, look, it's not just an issue of you killing somebody and being guilty, that there's more to it than that. If you're angry with your brother, you're guilty. Now, having read what we just read in the law, why do you think it is that Jesus is expanding this idea of murder to being angry with your brother? So if you can get the death penalty for murdering somebody, and you can get the death penalty for kidnapping him, and you can get the death penalty for striking your parents.
All those things.
Right, yeah. I've never done those things. I'm not guilty. So why would Jesus then extend this to the idea of anger?
Because it's a hard issue.
Yeah, so he's dealing with the idea of what's in your heart and about what murder really is. So murder is the destruction of the image of God. That's what murder is. But there's more ways to destroy the image of God in somebody than just by physically murdering them. Okay, so from a kind of ancient mindset, what is death? What does it mean to die? We actually talked about this idea that, and we'll go to a blank slide here. So this is our ancient view of reality. Okay, so in the ancient world, reality consists of two things. You guys remember? Spirit and flesh. Okay, so let's say I was watching a TV show about this hunter, and this hunter was trying to be able to hunt and gather in a big city. So he chose San Francisco, and he wanted to prove that you could hunt and gather enough food in San Francisco to live off of. And so the first thing that he does is he comes across a raccoon that's dead by the side of the road. It's roadkill. And so he starts investigating this raccoon, and he says, oh, it's really fresh, and he shows you a couple of ways that you can tell. He ends up making a meal for some of these like hipster-type San Francisco people, and he doesn't tell them that he's feeding them roadkill raccoon until after they've already eaten it. They weren't amused, some of them. So if you come across a raccoon, how do you know it's dead? You poke it. Okay, so we'll get a big stick and we'll poke it. And then what are some other things that we can do?
There might be some physical evidence that you can see.
Okay, there might be some physical evidence, some blood. If we poke it, and how do we know it's dead if we poke it? It doesn't react. There you go. These are simple questions. I'm glad that Bonnie saw through the apparent conundrum. The simple is good. So yes, if you poke it, it doesn't move, right? So the idea is that death is when spirit and flesh. So you can have a raccoon that 1 second earlier was alive and now it's dead, or a person. You can have a person that's dead, and 1 second earlier he was alive, and he looks exactly the same. And if he's only been dead for a second or a moment, you'll feel his skin, and it'll be warm, and it'll look the right color, and you won't know that person's dead. What's the difference between alive and dead? Well, the flesh is largely the same, but the spirit is gone. That's the idea in the ancient world, is that life is the marriage of spirit and flesh, and death is the separation of spirit and flesh. So if spirit and flesh are connected, we have life. If spirit and flesh are disconnected, we have death. All right? So here's the thing you can think about from this standpoint. You can go outside and you can ask people. We could go down over to the park over here, and there's probably people over there doing stuff, and we could say, well, what is marriage? And we can probably get 1 million different answers. And we can get some people that say it's just a piece of paper, it's nothing, it doesn't mean anything. Okay, fair enough. Well, what is patriotism? What does it mean to be an American? And we can get some people that say, well, it's a piece of paper, you get, it says you're a citizen, and it really is, it doesn't mean anything. And we could go down the line and we could ask all kinds of people, what is fatherhood? What does it mean to be a mother? All those things. The idea behind that is that the flesh, let's say we take the idea of fatherhood, so somebody's biologically connected to somebody else, they're a father, but without the Spirit telling us what that means and what's important about it and all the things that are valuable to it and establishing the value of fatherhood, without that, it's just dead, right? Because there's all kinds of people walking around in the world who have a biological father that they've never met and have never gotten anything from, and you see what I'm saying? That's dead. The idea here is that spirit and flesh have to be connected, and once they're not connected anymore, then that's when you have death. So what does this mean exactly? So the idea here is that when you're angry with somebody and you kill the image of God, what are you doing? What are you doing to them? So let's say we have, we'll say Roy is his name. Roy here. And Roy has a body, but then there's a spiritual meaning to Roy. And what's the spiritual meaning to Roy? He's made in the image of God, right? Can we kill him without actually destroying his body?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, we can. We certainly can. And in fact, what's really interesting is that when you look at the history of the world and people really want to cause trouble, what do? They separate the image of God from a group of people and they say, well, they're not really humans, right?
It's happening today.
It does. It happens all of the time. It happens all of the time through history. And the thing is, go ahead.
I have a footnote on this.
Go ahead.
It says anger keeps us from developing a spirit pleasing to God. And then it goes on because this is life application.
Uh-huh.
Have you ever been proud that you didn't strike out and say what was really on your mind? Self-control is good, but Christ wants us to practice thought control as well. Jesus said that we will be held accountable even for our attitudes.
Yeah.
So just because you don't say it, but you're thinking it,
Yeah, and so the idea that we have here is that we can actually kill Roy. We can kill Roy. Didn't know that was going to. We can. That was purely accidental. We can destroy Roy. We can destroy him by removing that image of God from him, by not treating him with the value that it has because he's made in his image.
Are we destroying Roy, or are we destroying ourselves?
Yeah, that's the thing.
We're not really able to take the image of God away from him.
Right. Yeah, that's the thing. So how can you, so there was a big question about, in World War II, how could these guys work at these concentration camps? Or they had groups of SS in the Eastern European part of the war, when they invaded Russia and Latvia and all those little countries. They had groups of soldiers that were just made up of regular guys whose job was to go around rounding up groups of Jews that had kind of slipped through the cracks, and then just shoot them. Just line them up and shoot them. And that's what they did for the entirety of the war in the Eastern Front, is they just gathered people. And the question was, how could these guys do this? How could they just, go home, have families, all that kind of stuff? And what they found out was that it wasn't actually easy at all, that there was a huge, huge psychological toll that was taken on these guys by doing this. It destroyed them to do this kind of work. And in fact, there were guys who were not, Nazi fanatics, who were, Germans and German soldiers, generals, commanders, who desperately did not want their troops to take part in this because they knew that this would destroy them. And it did, to a large extent. To a lot of these soldiers were just completely psychologically destroyed from this. So you're right. It does. And that's what Jesus is trying to say is, look, don't do this. Don't do this. Because the thing is, how can you devalue the image of God in somebody else when that's the only thing that you have that's working for you? That's where you get your value from. You can't undermine the source of somebody else's value and uphold yours at the same time. It doesn't work like that. So
They can't see Christ in you when you've got all this other stuff filling your mind.
right.
And coming out of your mouth.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about this is that there's a connection to worship that runs from the very first aspect of murder all the way to what Jesus is saying here. And I find that really interesting. So Jesus says that if you're at the altar and you're giving your gift at the altar and you realize somebody has something against you, then you need to leave the altar and you need to go and be reconciled to your brother. And I find that interesting, especially that he uses the word brother there, because if you go all the way back to chapter 4 of Genesis, you have the story of Cain and Abel, the very first murder, and it also has to do with the idea of worship and sacrifice. And that's a really fascinating thing that Jesus uses. Again, we're talking about how Jesus is the fulfillment of all of this law, and Jesus is pulling things out of the Old Testament constantly and pushing them together in ways that are really fascinating. And here he's saying, look, you can murder somebody by being upset with them, and then he ties it back into worship, just like what happened in chapter 4 of Genesis with Cain and Abel. So the question is, why does Jesus do that? Why does murder and worship, why do those two things go together? Yes, okay, good point. Let's look at Romans chapter 12, verse 15. So the idea here is that when we worship, we're declaring the worth of something, right? Romans 12:15. Who's got that?
Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep.
Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Why? Why should we do that? Why are we called to experience the emotions of our fellow human beings? Is it easy to always do that? Is it easier sometimes when somebody's rejoicing? Let's say somebody got the promotion. Somebody, you're in a competition with somebody, and they just did the thing that you've been trying to do for a long time, and you've not succeeded, and all of a sudden they show up and they succeed. And they're like, woohoo, this is great. I was watching this show about quadruple backflip. So on a BMX bike, guys trying to go down a hill, off a ramp, and in the air, do 4 backflips before he lands. And there's 2 guys trying to do this. They've both been working on it, and it shows them they're crashing, they're landing, they're going to the hospital, they're breaking bones, they're doing all this kind of stuff. Both of them want to be the first guy to do a quadruple backflip. Now, why? I don't know. It doesn't seem like something I want to do. Yes, exactly, for the glory. So finally this guy lands it, and the guy that he's in competition with happens to be there, and the camera shows this guy landing, and everybody jumps up and celebrates, except for the guy he's in competition with, who's just kind of staring at the ground, and he's visibly upset. Like he's gone to the hospital, who knows how many times, broken who knows how many bones, trying to do this thing. Now, he's clearly not celebrating and being happy with the guy who's being happy, but he's being called to do that. Why? This is actually harder than it seems, to actually rejoice with people when they do something, even people that we're in competition with, even sometimes our enemies. When our enemies do something good, do something amazing, we're called to rejoice, and when something bad happens, to be sad with them. And the issue here is why. If both of these things have to do with worship, what happens when we worship? We declare the worth of something. But what is it that we're declaring the worth of? We're declaring the worth of God. And when we declare the worth of God, here's the interesting thing. You can find a whole bunch of people in this world who will never darken the door of a church and never worship God because it's stupid, because it's silly, and because their pride won't let them. And yet, here's the interesting thing, that when we worship God and we lift Him up and declare His worth, we're actually not just lifting up God. If we're made in the image of God, and if God is truly great, then what does that mean?
We're great.
Yeah. So here's an interesting thing. The more that you worship and glorify God, the more that you get lifted up as well. And I'm not saying we should worship ourselves. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that when we truly worship God and we truly have a high view of God, you will end up being elevated through that worship as well. It's really interesting, isn't it, that as our Western culture has gotten farther and farther away from worship, that human life has become less and less valuable.
I think this happens. A parent, when he sees his child do something, can join in that worship. Because that child is part of the parent.
Right.
And if you and I are both in the image of God and both have God in us, we are related in a way.
Yeah.
And so we should, it's easy to say,
Right.
but we should rejoice in what, unless
Right.
you got what I wanted, then it's a little harder.
Right.
But I can see it with a relative.
Sure. And that's a great example, because you have fathers who, when their sons surpass them, can truly rejoice. And then you have fathers who, when their sons surpass them, are just angry. Right? They're just sullen, they're angry. And the interesting thing about that is it's a huge credit to a father when his son surpasses him. But yet some people can't see that, because they can't see the connection there. And the point here is, I think, that when Cain what Cain doesn't understand when he kills Abel is that, he has to become a wanderer through the earth. And I think that he's destroyed the image of God in his brother, and by doing that has also destroyed the image of God in himself. And the end result is that there is a wandering in the earth that is the natural outcome of that. And I think that what happens is, when Jesus is saying, look, if you know your brother has something against him, go be reconciled, because how do you worship God and not worship let's say you go to a church and there's a statue of Jesus up there, and you're worshiping at that church, and maybe it's a Catholic church, and you've got statues all over with the candles, and you go in and you light a candle to some statue, and then you go and you see your neighbor and you yell at him. Well, how do you? That person is more the representation of God than that statue is. How are you going to go in there and worship there and then not you understand what I'm saying? How are you going to elevate and declare the worth of God at the altar and not declare the worth of God when you're interacting with the people around you who are made in the image of God?
It adds a whole new depth to abortion, doesn't it?
It does. And I think that that's a great example of how, as we've gotten away from worship, the value of human beings has just been destroyed.
Well,
And-
whole part of this book of Romans that we were in, I
Uh-huh.
just picked one of the verses.
Right.
Is all about love in action.
Mhm.
Love your neighbor. Don't curse. Don't have evil thoughts.
Mhm.
But do this. So it's all, you've got to get rid of the crud.
Right.
And you've got to be positive, and it's to everyone. It's not just to the Republicans or to the Trump people, but it's to the Bidens and the Kamala Harrises. I mean, they're all made in God's image.
Sure.
And
Yeah, and that's why praying for our enemies becomes so important. If you can see somebody who's a political adversary and hate them over that, then the foundation of worth is no longer being made in the image of God. It's in something else. You now have a new God. Your God is a politics, it's skin color, it's whatever it is. That's the new God. It's not the fact that we're all made in the image of God, because they are.
Can you remove that image of God yourself from yourself?
Well, I think that you become blind to it. I think that you can become blind to it.
I was just thinking, if a person could say, well, I'm not going to have that attitude towards him because he doesn't have the image of God in the first place. That's kind of
that's justifying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, it'd be a hard thing for me to take Hitler and say that what we've been
You
talking
don't like
about.
what he did, but as a person made in God's image,
But yeah, I think there's an aspect of that where sometimes, and again, sometimes there's anger at the actions, and then there's anger at the person. And Jesus here is speaking about anger about the person. But sometimes we're upset about the actions because that person is made in the image of God. I was driving over from QT one morning, and to get out of QT over here, I have to go through by Dilly's and pull around and go. Anyway, the point is, I drove by a homeless guy who was sitting next to his cart full of stuff, and he was just sitting there, and he was leaned over, and I don't think I've ever seen more of a wreck of a human being in my life. And it was shocking as I saw him. His clothes in rags, just dirty, hair everywhere. And he had his shoes off, and he was sitting in this chair, and he had his feet out. And I've never seen feet as swollen as his were. And I thought, that has just got to be absolute agony and misery. This guy is just sitting here as a wreck of a human being in agony and misery. And the more you dislike the wreck, it's not that I dislike the wreck of his humanity because I dislike him. It's more of a tragedy because of that he isn't made in the image of God, if that makes sense. And so sometimes we get upset with the actions of people, but we should be upset with them because the actions are so far beneath the glory and dignity that God has bestowed on them. That's a different kind of anger and a different kind of wrath. And again, we have to remind ourselves that our struggle isn't against flesh and blood, but against powers and principles. It's not against them and who they are. It's against the thing that is destroying and corrupting the glory and the dignity that they were created with. So one of the things that we want to look at before we finish is Jesus goes through these three things about being liable or being punished, being in judgment. And he says that, first of all, if you're angry with your brother, what are you liable for? What are you guilty of? What can you look forward to if you're angry with your brother? You guys see that in the anger section?
Says we'll be liable to judgment.
Will be liable to judgment. So if you're angry with your brother, you're liable to judgment. Now the word here for judgment is the word for the local people who judge you. If you were in the Old Testament, if you killed somebody, then the town elders would come together and they would judge whether or not you were guilty of murder. That's the kind of judgment that's being spoken of there. Then what's the next one?
Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council.
So whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. Now the council is the Sanhedrin, and the kind of insult they're talking about is calling somebody like an empty head, right, or an airhead. So you say somebody's an airhead, and then you're liable to the council for that. And the council dealt with theological judgment. So when they accused Jesus of blasphemy, it's not a group of local, like the town or city elders that judge him. It's the Sanhedrin that judges him. Why? Because this is a theological matter. It's like you've been bumped up to a higher court. There's the lower court. You murder somebody, you deal with the people who are going to judge the death of your body. You do something theological, and you're going to be judged by people who will deal with or judge whether or not you're actually still in the covenant, right? And then there's one final one.
Whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire.
Whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. So this is ultimate judgment. This is after all that is, after you're dead kind of judgment, ultimate judgment. And so the idea of you fool, that's actually a stronger word. It's the word for morose or morose, and it's where we get the word moron from. So if you call somebody a moron, then no, it's a little bit different than that. So the idea of that word was about calling somebody a fool or foolish, and it had to do with there was an implication of being godless in that. When you call somebody godless, when you separate them from the image of God in your insult, then you're liable to the fires of hell, it's saying. So that's actually a pretty strong statement by Jesus. And what he's doing is he's saying, look, there's anger with your brother. That's a pretty bad thing. You're guilty of kind of the physical side of murder, and you should be judged incredibly harshly for that. Then there's a step up even more than that by calling somebody an empty head. And then there's a step even higher than that for calling somebody a fool, a moron, somebody who doesn't have any discernment, who's not connected with God. So those are some pretty strong words from Jesus about that, and it's something that we should take into consideration because really, remember, we talked about everything revolves around the cross. And Jesus in the cross dies for the sins of others. And really what we have here and what he's describing with anger and insulting people is really the destruction of other people because they're inconvenient for us. It's the antithesis of what the cross is about. The cross is about loving somebody so much that you're willing to die for their sins. This is where you're willing to destroy people because they become an inconvenience for you. They bother you. They make life hard for you. And so really what he's dealing with is the antithesis of who he is and what his ministry is. All right, so we'll finish with that, and then we will take on some more topics next week. So let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the blessings that you've given us. We ask that you'd help us to take your word seriously, Father, to have our hearts changed, that we might worship you. Father, that we might understand that in seeing the glory of who you are and the glory of the image that you have given others, that, Father, we are not taking anything away from ourselves, but But Father, not only are we adding to you and adding to them, but we're adding to our own glory. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.